Okay, so we're going to do a whole overview of the nervous system. So, again, we're going to be starting broad and general, and then we will get into details as we move forward. So, today is broad and general, and you have a sheet you can fill in as we move through. So, the nervous system is how your body interacts both with the external and internal environments and responds to changes. The nice thing about the nervous system, which we want to remember, and you can add some little notes onto your note as we go, the nervous system is electrical, so we conduct electricity, which makes it fast. Okay, so if we want things to happen quickly, the nervous system is the way to go. It coordinates actions, movements, and transmits signals all through your body, and it does this quickly. Basically, the nervous system makes you move and makes you feel things that happen to you. So, everything that's behavioral or psychological is simultaneously biological. So, that is a great statement right there. And this is important when we're talking about the nervous system and the endocrine system. Okay, you have to understand that the way you feel, what you're thinking, and your behaviors are really about anatomy and physiology, where you're conducting electricity, what chemicals are binding to which sites on which cells. And we're going to look at that in great detail, which is what makes the nervous system and the endocrine system so interesting, because they are literally responsible for who you are, your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors. So, the type of cell that we focus on for the nervous system is called a neuron. So, your nervous system is made up of many different kinds of neurons. And we're going to look in detail at what they look like, because they do look different than other cells, and they're also capable of conducting electricity, which makes them different. And you have just billions of them, billions of neurons. So we're going to start by looking at the main subdivisions of the nervous system. First of all, your nervous system is divided into two main systems. Okay, the central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord. So this is where all the processing happens. Okay, so this is where signals are processed, and then actions happen based on that processing. The peripheral nervous system is all the nerves outside of the brain and spinal cord, and it connects everything to the brain and spinal cord. So it's all those nerves that exit the spinal cord and go to all your limbs and organs. Now, your peripheral nervous system is divided up further. So it's divided up into your somatic nervous system. That's the part of the peripheral nervous system that's associated with skeletal muscles and voluntary controls of body movements. So these are the signals that you control with your brain to move your body. The one exception to this fact that you control it is reflexes. Okay, reflexes you don't control, but they are still skeletal muscles contracting and causing actions. So it's still considered a somatic part of the somatic nervous system, but you actually don't control your reflexes. And the peripheral nervous system is also divided up into the autonomic nervous system. So autonomic meaning automatic, right? These things are not things you focus and think about. So this part of the nervous system controls the function of internal organs. So obviously, if we had to think about contracting our heart all day and contracting all our digestive system with the peristalsis to digest food and thinking about a gas exchange in our lungs and inhaling and exhaling, if we had to think about these things all day, we could accomplish nothing else. So our nervous system, the autonomic part, takes care of these specific actions. The autonomic system is also further divided into two categories. Sympathetic nervous system is the part of the autonomic nervous system called fight or flight. So, this is the system we engage when we're anxious, when there's an emergency. Okay, and sometimes we get anxious about things that aren't an emergency, but our body is still we're still engaging that sympathetic nervous system. So all these physiological reactions are occurring. So there's chemicals being released and electricity being conducted and muscles contracting and some relaxing. And so we're going to look at the fight or flight in great detail, but it is not under your control. And sometimes we trigger it and we shouldn't be, like when we're writing an exam. So you can actually trigger this part of your nervous system and you don't write a good exam if you're working with your sympathetic nervous system. So you need to flip over to the parasympathetic nervous system. And if you're thinking, well, these are automatic, I don't control them. No, you don't per se, but there are ways you can flip from a sympathetic reaction to a parasympathetic reaction. So we're going to just talk about that a little bit later. But the parasympathetic nervous system is what is engaged when you're calm. It's not necessarily to calm just to calm the body after a fight or flight response. It's engaged whenever you're feeling relaxed or calm. So, this is your eating and watching TV sort of part of your nervous system would be engaged when you're doing relaxing things like that. So that's parasympathetic. So we're just going to do a quick overview of a neuron. So neurons, there are parts of the neuron. If you look at this cell, it looks different than the typical spherical cells that we look at. This one is branched, and that should make good common sense because your nervous system is all about connections. I always talk about connections with your brain. You got to make a connection. You got to keep a connection. You got to reinforce a connection. And because these neurons are branched, that's what they're about. So they still have your basic cell parts like a nucleus. So again, the nucleus, that's, it's going to contain the DNA, right? All the same things that go on inside a nucleus. But it also has these parts which aren't typical called dendrites. So dendrites are these branches. Information, when it says it receives information goes into dendrites. And when we say information, I mean electrical signals, right? That is what information is at the cellular level. So signals always enter the dendrites, so the electricity. Because neurons conduct electricity in one direction only. So it will go into the dendrites. And then the signal or electricity will be conducted towards the nucleus down this long, what's called the axon, and out the axon terminal. And so this is all about direction. So electricity will only go in one direction. We talk about neurons. The axon is an extension, this long extension that carries neural messages, electricity, away from the nucleus towards other neurons or muscles or glands. It depends where its end point happens to be. Parts of a neuron. There's something called a myelin sheath, fatty cells covering the axon, which help speed neural impulses. So these fatty cells, if you remember from our macromolecule unit, we talked about the different types of fats. And the saturated, the polyunsaturated, monounsaturated. So you might remember those polyunsaturated fats are the ones we so need, that we tend not to get enough of in our diet. So I talked about these, that you find them in salmon and cold water fish oils. These are especially good for what we call myelinating, or increasing the lipid content in the sheath in your brain. So that's why they say you should be taking fish oils or omega-3s for brain health. Yeah, you want to be conducting your neural impulses in your brain really quickly and efficiently, and you don't want them jumping from one neuron to another. So that's where another place where those really healthy unsaturated fats come into play. But we need to have fats. We need fats. They literally insulate all our axons in all our neurons. So very, very important. Next, parts of a neuron. So these, the axon terminal is, again, when we're talking about directionality, is where the signal exits. Okay, so it's all about direction. And you don't know what a synapse is, but we'll really look at that in great detail once we start going into the details. Again, we're just doing a general overview here. As well, we're going to be looking at some different types of neurons next lesson. So we're going to dive into the neuron just a little bit more. Here's just a quick overview of what a synapse is. Space-based junctions through which neurons pass electrical or chemical signals to each other. Again, this is just really very basic. We'll be getting into those in great detail. So when a neuron is inactive, or there's no information, they call it information being conducted through it, no electricity being conducted through it, that is called resting potential. So when that happens, the inside of the neuron is negatively charged and the outside is positively charged. So remember, these are cells, and we'll talk a little more about that charge. When a neuron is active, called action, that should say potential. It seems to be covered there. Anyway, you can take this down. We will be getting into great detail about action potentials and exactly how they happen. They can be a bit complicated. When an action potential is happening, it means the neuron is conducting electricity, or we call that firing. Neurotransmitters are these chemicals that cross the gaps between neurons, and they move signals from one neuron to another. So these things are, this firing is required to move parts of your body, to contract muscles, so you got to conduct electricity to them, to create memories. Okay, so we have to actually, conduct electricity through these pathways, and they have to cross these synapses to create memories, which is another interesting thing we're going to be looking at. Sending drugs throughout the brain, all kinds of things. So when the ions are switching places, there's an intensity threshold. And again, this will make more sense when we go into great detail. Any unused or excess chemicals are sucked back up, or neurotransmitters, into the original neuron, and this is known as reuptake. And again, we'll be looking at that in great detail later. So types of neurons. So for now, we'll keep it simple. There's actually way more than 3 types of neurons, but we're going to start simple. There's afferent or sensory neurons. Send sensation information you experience up to your brain. Okay? So again, we need senses for this to work. So we have sensors internally, we have sensors externally, and we'll look at those sensors. I'll attach a little video either today or tomorrow. Efferent muscle movement carries, impulses are carried out from the brain. So afferent is going into the brain where it's processed, and efferent, or think exit, I always think exit efferent is exiting the brain. And it usually ends at a muscle or a gland for an action. So you're either going to contract a muscle or release some, hormones. And the interneurons, communication neurons in the spinal cord and brain. Okay. So interneurons, I don't necessarily agree with this note. Your interneurons are your brain and your spinal cord. This makes it sound like it's just the spinal cord. Now, neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that transmit, or they go from one neuron to another. They continue the pathway. They cause the electrical signal to move from one to the other. And for complicated organisms like ourselves, we actually have chemicals that do this. So primary chemical for this is acetylcholine. It's primarily involved in memory and learning, and also makes motor movement possible. So that's one we definitely want to be taking advantage of. Too little acetylcholine is linked to Alzheimer's disease because of its involvement in memory. Dopamine is associated with the pleasure center of the brain, also highly involved in movement and alertness. So too little dopamine is linked to Parkinson's disease. Too much is linked to schizophrenia. And we're all highly addicted to this neurotransmitter. We all love our dopamine, which is why it's released. It's like our reward messenger. So it rewards us when we do things that make us feel accomplished. But we'll talk a little more about dopamine later. Serotonin is involved in mood control, and endorphins are primarily involved in pain relief. So we tend to release a lot of endorphins after we exercise, especially really hard exercise. And that's why, if you have a bit of a headache or some aches and pains, you go exercise, they're gone for a little while. It's because you've released these endorphins. So endorphins are really good. And just lastly, there are, if we look at psychoactive drugs, they work by messing with these neurotransmitters. Okay, so these are things that cross the blood-brain barrier, and they are binding to receptors in our neurons. And they can literally change the wiring of your brain. So drugs typically interact with neurons by being agonists, which means they mimic the neurotransmitters. So they actually bind to the receptor sites and cause electricity to be conducted when normally they wouldn't be. Okay, so heroin is a good example of an agonist, and it mimics endorphins. Antagonists block receptor sites. So these work by preventing signals from being transmitted. So Botox blocks facial muscle movement connectors. So they're literally, the electricity isn't being conducted as opposed to is. And then there's reuptake inhibitors. So they stop the reuptake process of excess neurotransmitters in the synapse. This increases the amount of the chemical in the brain. And SSIs are used quite frequently for anxiety and depression. And even for reflux, of all things. Okay, so I guess that'll be it for now. Just a quick little overview. Take these things down in your note. And I'm going to attach the video on the different sensory neurons and senses, and then we'll continue with that next.